And now we'll get on to the drums. So you'll see here we have these blue guys, blue color-coded tracks, which are the drums. Some of them are not grouped with the actual drums group because there's a lot of saturation and compression things going on that I didn't want them to go through that. So for example, this kick effect it's one of my own samples. It's already quite muddy in the low end, and I didn't want it to go through all of this parallel compression and parallel distortion and saturation and EQ and all of that. So I just put it outside of the group. And then I also have this sample. This is a stem, this is like some tops that I'm using. Again, and I didn't want it to go through all of this processing because these tops are already quite processed. And in the middle of it all, it already kind of glues to the sound, so I didn't really want to destroy the sound a bit more than what it was. And the same happens here for these tambourines. Okay, and that's pretty much it for these tops and that kick effect. And then now for the drums, it's a lot of tracks. I'll just play them on their own for a second here. Okay, cool. So kick is just a kick with a little bit of transient designing. It's one of my own samples, I think. Yeah. Just a kick from Serum, really, with a little bit of noise. EQs do change the tone even when it's only small changes. This guy's not really doing anything, that's why it's not being used. And then for the snare, it's just one main sample and then a couple of texture layers. It's basically this sample with a couple of extra layers that I'm using. So this layer is being sidechained to the main one. This layer from the actual snare of perception that I'm just using this bottom end. Then this guy I'm just using the tops, and this guy I'm just using the noise. And all of them together, they sound like this. The only thing that I'm doing to kind of glue them all together is just using the saturator. But the important thing here is to know that they're kind of in time. They kind of make sense in time. So if you look at the tails, so I'm fading in this guy because it had a transient. So I'm fading it in. They all kind of end up in the same time because I don't want some of the samples to have longer tails than others because that will just make it obvious that's different sounds being put at the same time. And I want them to sound glued. So I just make the tails kind of end up at around the same time, which is here. Yeah. This one has a little bit of a low end tail, so it's not really perceivable, or if that's the word. Yeah, so all of the tails kind of end up at the same time, which is very important for me to make them sound glued. Because sometimes people will instantly use compressors and saturation and all of that stuff to glue sounds, but these sounds are already quite processed. Especially the snare. I know this snare is my own snare. I've made it myself. I know it is already a lot processed, so I don't want to process a lot more. This is another snare that I've made myself, so I know it's really processed already. And this is the actual snare from the drums, and I know it probably is a lot processed already. You can see, if you look at the drums, you can see they're very, very loud and yeah, very, very squarish. So they're probably already heavily processed. So I'm just basically removing the transient with this and just focusing on the lows because I really like the body of this. So I'm just keeping that body, and then I'm sidechaining it to the main hit again, and then I'm using this layer which already kind of has a fade in and a fade out, and just bringing that tail down, kind of making sure everything fades out at the same time. And I'm using this noise layer that I've made myself also with just some white noise and Serum. Okay, so that is the snare. Then I have a couple of hats. Nothing crazy about hats. just a hat on the beat. This big hat being sidechained to the kick, that's why it has this kind of characteristic of going up. And then some 8th note hats, a ghost snare, which is from the stems, and then some rides come in eventually, I think. Yeah, some rides come in. Just high pass that. And yeah, so let's take a listen to the drums without any processing. There's still parallel compression and parallel distortion. So they sound a little bit more compressed and squashed like this, and bigger as well. The tails sound bigger, the shorter elements sound louder. The lower elements sound louder. So I'm using the Brainwork saturator, which is it's so good actually. So this lets you saturate the sides and the mids separately, and also the lows and the highs. So you get to saturate just the side highs, the side lows, the mid lows, and the mid highs, which is good. So I'm doing a little bit of saturation and also stereo expanding here. I'm not doing anything in the master or any of that. And then it goes through the SSL EQ channel strip, just basically using this here, not really doing any EQing, just doing a little bit of input gain and a little bit of THD, which is kind of their saturation thing. But in terms of EQing, I'm not really doing anything. I'm just using the high pass function to do some automations and stuff. And I'm also just using the input gain and a little bit of THD there. Then there's this filter thing that you can use for progressions and filters and all of that. I'm using a little bit of a multiband on the tops because they get a little bit too much at certain points. So I'm just making sure that they're not too ear piercing, because that, especially in clubs, although there's not really any clubs going on. Actually, there is now loud music going on, but at the time this was made, there wasn't anything. I think it was like during 2020 summer. I don't think there was stuff going. At least here where I live, there wasn't really anything going on. And then just a little bit of saturation and soft clipping going on, and that's pretty much it for the drums. I am using though a little bit of parallel compression. And before the parallel compression, I'm boosting the lows and boosting the highs, so the compressor has more things, more harmonics on the low end, which are very heavy for compressors, and on the top end as well. And I'm just completely squashing the drums with two different compressors, so it sounds like this. You can see it's very low. I just want this to basically push the tails and compress the sound and kind of feed this compressed signal with the dry signal. You can see it just glues the sound a little bit more and pushes those hats and those tails a little bit more to the front. So yeah, that's pretty much it that's going on with the drums.